the Jewish communities worked together very closely with international. Oops. Oh. I was muted. So what I wanted to say was the Jewish communities. Oh, I'm still muted?
No.
No, okay. The Jewish communities, they were working together quite closely with international help organizations. So for example, here we see a picture of Jewish Berliners who were standing in line to receive donations from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or JOINT in short. The Jewish community in Berlin, for example, they were writing a report, and under the heading welfare, they were writing something that really is giving us a very important insight into how terrible things really were immediately after the war. So they say the issue of clothing is especially urgent for most members of the community because most of them were stripped of all property by the Nazi measures, and because Jews were not issued a clothing ration card during the war, and so could not purchase any clothing replacements. There is a particular lack of men's suits, shoes, and underwear. Thus far, 8 officials have been unable to acquire clothing. 83.5% of Jews in Berlin lack adequate clothing. So subsequently, the international help organizations were not only providing the Jewish Berliners with clothing, but also with food. And as we can see here, in early 1946, with matzah that was brought over from America for the first Pesach, for the first Passover holiday in the spring of 1946. The so-called joint packages, they were like the care packages, but they were coming from the joint. They were very sought after because they also contained cigarettes, and people were using them, using cigarettes as currency on the black market. And that was in a time where this was often the only way to earn some money. The joint was actually also instrumental in creating the so-called DP camps, the displaced person camps. So this one here is a picture of the biggest one. This is the camp Föhrenwald. And these camps, they were usually, they had about 500 of them, mostly in the American sector, which was in southern Germany. And these camps were usually reappropriated soldiers' barracks, sometimes hotel settlements, sometimes hotels, sometimes like settlements that were built in the 1920s and 1930s for industrial workers. Sometimes there were former schools or hospitals. And in some cases, non-Jewish Germans were forced out of their apartments and out of their houses, and then whole streets were turned into these DP camps. But still, the living conditions were not for the faint of heart. The biggest problem was posed by the overcrowding. It was not unusual that a camp that had been laid out for, let's say, maybe 1,500 people had to deal with 5,000 people, who were living there in a space that was created for like 1,500. So it was very crowded. But in spite of this, the DP camps developed a lively existence on their own. For example, in Berlin, by 1947, there was a camp in the western part of the city that housed about 10,000 people, including 1,000 infants and children. And they already had established, and this is really like maybe 1.5 years after the war, they had established 3 schools, several summer camps. Also in 1946, you have the Herzl public Hebrew school in Berlin that already had 400 students. And then, of course, as you can see here, there are some pictures of this of Jewish DPs in Germany. They were celebrating Hanukkah. And you also had quite quickly a very remarkable marriage boom. And then usually about a year later, you had a baby boom that could be observed from 1945 to 1947. The only DP camp in the British sector, because as I said, most of them were in the American sector, and the British sector was in northern Germany. They had, incredible, from 1945 to 1947, there's only 2 years, they had 1,000 marriages to celebrate in those 2 years. And then especially in the second half then of 1946, approximately 750 babies were born every month in the official USDP camps alone. Education was very important for the DP camps. In that newspaper, Unser Leben, which means the path, one of the DPs wrote, "The young people are our only surviving hope, and our future is dependent on their education." So consequently, every child had to go to school until they were 18 years old. But then when they were 15 years old, they had a 2-tier system. They had to go to school in the morning, and then they also in the afternoon had to learn a profession. And that happened very early on. So for example, in November of 1945, already that biggest camp in Föhrenwald, which is near Munich, that camp already taught 350 children in Hebrew, English, math, and also here, this is math. And then, of course, they had drawing, they had sports, they had music. The camp leaders wanted to make sure that the young people also got a Jewish, a religious education. So then already in October of 1945, the Bet Jacob School for Girls was opened. And and then you have a very important rabbi, Yehuskiel Yehuda Halberstam. He created a yeshiva that was already attended by 150 men in February of 1946. So you can imagine that very early on, the DPs set their sights on Palestine, because they hoped that one day their state, Israel, would be founded. And in order to prepare for this eventuality, Jewish leaders created, and that is something that not everybody knows, there were kibbutzim in Germany, on German soil. And this is one of the biggest ones, the kibbutz auf dem Streicherhof. This was located near Nuremberg. And the interesting thing about this one was that it once belonged to the despicable Julius Streicher, who was the editor of a very racist Nazi newspaper called Der Stürmer. And he was convicted in Nuremberg, and he died after the Nuremberg trials. And so since nobody owned this now, because he was dead, these kibbutzim, this was turned into a kibbutzim. And there were actually 30 of them. Most of them were in Bavaria. And they were basically training camps, or training farms, one could say. And these, here you see some of them, they usually had about 70 young DPs who were living in these places. And so they learned the know-how of farming. And that, of course, also prepared them for the future in Israel. So here we see, this is another farm, Jewish farm, as they called it, Zettlitz. And so speaking of newspapers, there were also between 1945 and 1951, over 100 newspapers and magazines. Yes, some of them were short-lived, but still, it's quite a tremendous number. They existed in these DP camps and among the Jews that were living outside of the camps, which would be the German Jews, because the German Jews were not in the camps. And so they were overwhelmingly, they were publishing all the articles in Yiddish, but they were also doing that in Polish, Hungarian, German, Romanian, Lithuanian, and Hebrew. And so they first started out as carbon copies, hand-written, because they didn't really have any printing presses, right? But then printing presses were actually brought in from America, so that was great. And so that, of course, made the process much easier. But it wasn't really without any problems, because at first, the Hebrew letters used for the Yiddish writing could not be obtained in Germany. So most of the Yiddish newspapers were initially in Latin letters. But then with the help of the Joint and other welfare organizations, the first Hebrew letters reached Germany in late 1945. And so that was then, of course, aiding really tremendously in the publication of a regular Yiddish and Hebrew press. The most favorite hobby that the people had was engaging in sports, most notably in soccer. There were even soccer leagues and this was, there were, these were teams that were coming from the various DP camps, and they would meet on the weekends, and then they would have their matches, and they would be quite competitive. In early 1946, there were already 69 Jewish sports clubs in existence. And so in spite of what may have become over time more or less acceptable conditions in these DP camps, in spite of that, the overwhelming amount of people who lived there was adamant that they, at the first opportunity that would present itself to them, would leave, because they wanted to leave Germany, obviously. They wanted to go, and let's see where they wanted to go. Because here, look at that. This is from April of 1946. And so the Anglo-American Committee was asking, you can see 138,320 DPs, and they were asking them, which country would you like to immigrate to? And look what the answer was. 85% said Palestine. And then, of course, when 1948 came along, and with it, the opportunity to leave Germany and to start a new life in either the United States or in Eretz Israel, the overwhelming majority took this opportunity. So here we see DPs leaving Germany by train for France. And then, of course, they would go to Genoa mostly, and then they would go from Genoa to Israel. So, and here, look, they're very happy dancing the hora at the train station. But, about 7,000 Jewish DPs stayed back in Germany, and they founded communities on their own, therefore contributing to the diversity of the Jewish community that we have in Germany right now. So when we talk about the Jewish community in Germany after the Second World War, it was basically made up by three groups. And you see that here. First of all, you have the aforementioned Eastern European DPs that decided to stay in Germany, like a little tiny number, like 7,000. Then you have the German Jews that survived or that came back from exile. That's a little number of 15,000. And then you have the third group in later decades by immigrants that have been coming to Germany since the 1950s, from Hungary, from Israel, from Iran, Czechoslovakia, and then, of course, in the 1990s, massively from Russia. So we're going to talk about that, of course, a little later. And the diversity of the Jews in Germany can also be explained by geographical circumstances. Because look, we already talked about the fact that the DP camps are mostly in Bavaria. So they are in southern Germany. So that is why southern Germany became home to the Jews from Eastern Europe, whereas northern Germany and also the western parts of the country were traditionally the home of the German Jews. So we can see this here quite impressively when we look at these numbers from 1949. You can see that 93.7% of all Jews in Bavaria and 81.6% of all Jews from Württemberg, which is the area where Stuttgart is. Nowadays it's called Baden-Württemberg. So this is all very much in the south of Germany, that these people were from Eastern Europe. But the percentage of Eastern European Jews in the Jewish communities of other German states is really quite interesting when you look at it. 28.6% of them were in Berlin only. More than 70% of the Jews in Berlin were German Jews. Then you have 23.4% in Lower Saxony, which is northern Germany. And then Western Germany is 23.8% in North Rhine-Westphalia. And then Rhineland-Palatine is the area of Mainz and Worms, only 13%. So it's really quite interesting, isn't it? And so the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews, in many cases, didn't really get along very well because of their different religious orientations. While the German Jews were, for the most part, members of the more liberal, more conservative Jewry, the Jews that had come from Poland or from Russia and now who lived in Bavaria were much more Orthodox. In 1950, there was the founding of the, as we call it, Zentralrat, which means the Central Council of Jews in Germany, and that tried to bridge these differences a little bit and bring them all together under this one umbrella. And now we had about 17,000 Jews that were living in Germany that belonged to this community, but they were also, there was also an unspecified number of Jews that refused to become a member of that Jewish community, you know, maybe because of ideology, maybe because of taxes, maybe because of so many other reasons. And in order to bring back further normalcy between 1950 and 1967, you have 40 synagogues that were built or that were reconstructed in West Germany. Here we see the reopening of the synagogue in Munich in 1947. And then this is a photo of the laying of the foundation stone ceremony of the Jewish Community Center in Berlin's Fasanenstraße. So that's a very important building for the Jewish community in Germany and also, of course, in Berlin. Heinz Kalinski, look at this man. So you see here, he's at the microphone. This is Heinz Kalinski. Heinz Kalinski was the head of the Jewish community there for over 50 years. So he is a very, very important person. He, of course, he passed away because he would have been over 120 or so, but yeah. But look behind him. I don't know if you recognize him. He's quite young there. This is Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt was our chancellor of West Germany in the 1960s, in the late 60s. But at that point, in 1957, he was the governing mayor of West Berlin. So that's why we see him here right behind Heinz Kalinski. And please remember that name because we will meet Heinz Kalinski a little bit later. And so this is what the building looks like nowadays. So you can imagine living in Germany, in the land of the perpetrators, was, of course, a special challenge for Jewish people, especially right after the war. Many survivors were plagued by feelings of course, hatred, you can imagine, when they thought about living among the German population again. The report of a visitor of a Jewish DP camp shows this conflicting attitude quite clearly. So take a look at this. It says, "I hate the Germans," is the general expression. "I can't bear to see them. I could kill them all in cold blood." But when the conversation continues, it turns out that the subject is soon my friend Schmidt and our dear neighbors, the Müllers. For even the greatest hatred cannot live in complete isolation when you have to go on living where the torment took place. Still, many of them were battling a bad conscience for staying in Germany and not immigrating, you know, not going to Israel or not going to America. And for many years, a very common dictum was, "We are sitting on packed suitcases," because that meant that many Jews did not even entertain the idea of actually staying in Germany as a long-term option. And this is while they were living there for the longest time. They were living there for decades. So this goes on until now, actually, you know, or maybe until the 90s and the 2000s, that people were still saying we're sitting on packed suitcases. A survey from 1964 demonstrates that quite clearly. There was this young man by the name of Jacob Oppenheimer. He was working in Frankfurt. He was the director of the Frankfurt Jewish Youth Center, and he did while he was doing his dissertation, he was analyzing questionnaires by 274 Jewish youths that were administered. These were people between the ages of 9 and 18. And so he was asking them, where would you most like to live? And look at the answer. This is 1964. 73% of them said Israel, 18% of them said United States, and 8% said Germany. And these were people who were, of course, born in Germany. These were people who grew up there. Isn't that so interesting? And one of the reasons why we have this result could have been, we are speculating a little bit, but it could have been the experience of the Eichmann Trial, that happened, of course, in 1961, 60 years ago this year. The Auschwitz trials that were happening right there, in the mid-1960s, that revealed the scope of the atrocities committed by the Germans in the Second World War. So then you have another result, and this is 13 years later, 1977. And here the results are even more dramatic, because here we have 255 Jews that were asked. This is not only in Frankfurt, this is Germany-wide, and these people are not only young people, but people of all ages. And there you have 84% who stated that they did not feel that Germany was their homeland. And among the young people, the percentage was as high as 94.5%. So that, of course, also is very sobering when you think of it. However, a completely different picture arises a mere 13 years later. So this is 1990, with another poll of 377 Jews who lived in West Germany. And now, look at that. Now you have 56% who are now rejecting the statement that Israel is their real homeland. And despite their bond with Jewish culture, 64% regarded themselves above all as Germans. And that's an astonishing result in light of all of the other results that we just talked about. So clearly, over the decades, the Jewish population in Germany was able to overcome, at least to a certain extent, the terrible memories of the past, and they managed to feel at least somewhat at home in that country that was responsible for this horrible amount of suffering. And that, of course, this result here, I would say, clearly has to do with the fact that our contemporary Jewish community is much more dominated by a second generation, or even like a third generation or a fourth generation that was born and that grew up in Germany, of course, after the war. And so let's go back, though. I'd like to go back a couple of steps to look really at the situation of German Jews right after the war, and so especially those of them who emigrated to Palestine, which, of course, as we all know, later becomes Israel. So it's very interesting to see that the German Jews also saw Palestine as a popular safe haven even before the war started. So in 1933, so Hitler comes to power, and already you have 2,000 German Jews who are leaving. And then from 1933 to 1942, 55,000 German Jews immigrated to Palestine. And that meant it was the 24% of the total number of immigrants. And that again also means that in 1938, you have Palestine, you have 1.36 million people, and 30% of them are Jews. Very interesting. So 70% of the German Jews lived in cities. So German Jews, they were not very interested in living in the country. So they wanted to live in cities such as Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem. And during the immigration process, 36% of them were able to receive the so-called capitalist visa that allowed them to come to Palestine with no strings attached. And the only thing that they had to, well, that's a big string that was attached, because the only thing they had to bring was money, you know. So about 1,000 Palestine pounds, which was the equivalent of about 15,000 Reichsmark, or the equivalent of about 4,000 US dollars. And that again, 4,000 US dollars in the 1930s is nowadays as much as $60,000 nowadays. So you can see you cannot be very poor. You have to have money in order to do that. So that would be 36% of the German Jews who did that. And then another 32% of them came via a work visa. But soon, the new immigrants were realizing that life in Palestine, and then of course from 1948, life in Israel, was not easy, especially lawyers. So lawyers was a profession that was quite popular among the German Jews. They were facing tremendous difficulties. Before they were able to practice again, they had to pass the foreign bar, one could say. It was called the Foreign Advocates Examination. And this was, in a way, a bar exam that needed, for that, they needed to be fluent in Hebrew and in English, and they needed to be versed in British and even Turkish law. Imagine, I mean, if you are living in Munich and you are a lawyer, or you're living in Berlin, how are you going to do that when you're 40 or so? It's very, very difficult. So this is why this exam was a big reason why many German Jews who were lawyers tried their luck at farming. So you can imagine that that was not really crowned by success either. So they were very disillusioned, and they were, because it was like a very unfulfilling life for them. And in general, the chances to work in an intellectual profession, they were rather slim in this developing country. You had so much more possibilities if you were a worker, you know, if you were maybe a farmer, or you were a plumber, or you were somebody who could build up Israel, because this was a country that needed workers and needed farmers. It's interesting to see the phenomenon of the so-called remigration. So remigration means coming back to Germany from Israel. So that is a decision that was, of course, not easy for the people, you know, to move back to the land of the perpetrators. But that is a decision that was mostly upheld by men. So men were making this decision. Women, not really. It was mostly the men. And there's a dissertation from the early 1990s. And this dissertation on Jewish women in Germany was interviewing this woman there who was doing the dissertation. She was interviewing 29 Jewish women, and 17 of them were saying that they were more or less forced by their husbands to come back to Germany. And out of those 17, only 3 told the interviewer that they experienced life in Germany in a positive light. Imagine 3 out of 17. That's less than 20%. So the process to come back to Germany and enter the workforce once again was a big draw to the men, you know, especially to the lawyers, you know, because they were able then to establish successful careers in Germany, especially in the 50s and early 60s when we had the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle time. But still, we shouldn't really overstate that phenomenon of remigration, because studies show that it was really only about 15% of the immigrants that went to Israel who were moving back to Germany. The overwhelming amount of the people that left were staying there. I wanted to share this fascinating book with you here. This is dealing with various reasons why Jews were deciding to come back to Germany after the war. It was written by a German author, Andrea von Trauenfeld, and it says Going Back. And it was written it's from 2015, so it's relatively recent. And there she interviewed 16 female survivors, and in order to show you know that basically everybody really had a different reason for returning to Germany, I pulled out some of the key sentences from these interviews. So let's take a look at, for example, Alisa Weil. She says, when the nightmare in Germany is over, then we must all go back to Germany. There will just be Nazis or whoever there who were born into National Socialism and don't know anything else. We must go back to rebuild the country into a democracy. So that was how she describes her thought process. Gerda Rosenthal says, Germany, the land of the perpetrators, our friends asked when we left America. They were even coming to America and then they wanted to go back. They really held it against us. There were even people who cut off contact with us. They couldn't understand that anyone would go back to Germany. And then we have Ruth Thorsch, who says, we went back then. Why? Too much fighting. The War of Independence in 1948, the Sinai Campaign 1956. It was obvious to us that there would always be fighting. So we thought, go. And I haven't regretted it for 1 minute. So there we have somebody who actually has a positive light when it comes to that. And then Margot Wish says, a lot of people came back, which I can't understand. I came here because my husband came here. But of course, I was born here. It's my language, it's my culture. I just can't shake it off. It's part of me. Everyone I meet says, you're more German than the Germans, but I don't feel that way. What am I? And so here we have Andrea von Treuenfeld herself, who is talking about, what she thought when she was interviewing everybody. And she said, so why this difficult step back to a place that could never again be a home after the Holocaust? I didn't find any single all-encompassing answer in the interviews with these women. The reasons for their remigration are just as varied as their biographies and should only be understood within the context of each story. A sense of inner conflict remains in them, a search for belonging, because although they settled here again decades ago, this country is not their country anymore. The stories in this particular book and the findings in these various studies all are coming to the same conclusion. Remigrating back to Germany was a difficult thing to do, especially on the emotional level. And there was, of course, a big estrangement on part of the Jewish population when it comes to their homeland. Jews felt isolated. Many of them did not have any non-Jewish German friends. They were staying among themselves. There's this interesting study from 1977. Here you see 51% of Jewish men avoided contact with non-Jewish Germans, like every second, of them. 60% when it comes to women, even 60% did that. And so when you think of it, you could say, because many of them were very engaged in their own Jewish communities, and many of them lived in Jewish retirement communities. They were sending their children to Jewish schools. They were surrounding themselves with people of their own faith. And in a way, one can say, yes, Germany was not their homeland, but Judaism became their homeland. And this is where they felt safe, and this is where they felt understood. And another issue that is also important to mention was that the Jews who were living in Germany were also feeling isolated because there was this big backlash when it comes to criticism and even hatred that was thrown at them when it comes to the other international Jewish communities. Because these Jews, especially the ones who were in America, the ones who were in Israel, they just couldn't understand why anybody would want to live in the land of the perpetrators. And these diaspora Jews hated the Jews that were living in Germany. For example, there was these Jews that were living in Germany. They just had no success, convincing their Jewish brothers and sisters in faith that it actually was a brave thing to do, to come back. How courageous, how brave, how heroic it is to come back to Germany and to establish communities there and to make the world realize that Hitler had not won the war and that Germany was in fact not free of Jews. And the aforementioned head of the Jewish community, Heinz Kalinski, my favorite, he actually, there he is now a little older, he expressed it very poignantly in this quote that he once said. He said, I have always represented the point of view that the Wannsee Conference cannot be the last word in the life of the Jewish community in Germany. Therefore, I participated with a few others to restore the Jewish community in Berlin. I have never been one of those who considered the community here a liquidation community, but rather I have endeavored to give back to the survivors the belief in a restored new life. And one also has to see that, of course, Germany had been home to Jews for centuries, and so many generations were there. That's where they grew up, that's where they had their families, that's where they had their language, their businesses. And this sentiment is being so like movingly expressed by a letter that was written by a German Jew that was published in the late 1940s in Der Weg, in the Path, in that newspaper. And there he says, we are not leaving. And he says, we're not leaving because we believe we are good and true Germans. Germans who received their cultural training in German schools heard the word of God in German from the Jewish mouth of the rabbis and hear it still, and are not ashamed to announce that Germany is our fatherland and German is our mother tongue. I and people like me are staying in Germany because we do not want to leave, because no lunatic fool, no tempter should or could rob us of our German homeland, our Germany. So that's very patriotic. You can imagine that this patriotic attitude was bitterly contested by the World Jewish Congress. They were listening to this and they were saying, you have like a bird, as you would say in Germany, you have a bird. So because the thing is that in July of 1948, the World Jewish Congress issued a warning to the Jews of the world to never again settle in, as they said, on the blood-soaked earth of Germany. And in order to teach those Jews who remained in Germany a lesson, the WJC excluded all German members. In August of 1950, the Zionist Jewish Agency issued an ultimatum to all German Jews, and they said, okay, we give you 6 weeks, pack your bags right now. And then, of course, when this did not happen, and when German Jews were still staying in Germany, the agency closed all of their offices. And then in addition to that, it was very difficult, when it comes to the infrastructure, it was very difficult to find rabbis, to find people who wanted to live in Germany. And by 1960, they only had 7 rabbis who had agreed to come to Germany, along with 4 or 5 non-academic rabbis that had been trained in Poland. And so that is why, when then in 1950, when you have that creation of that council, the Central Council of Jews that I mentioned earlier, so here we have their website now, that eased the situation a little bit, like the tension that was happening there, because now it became clear to the Jews of the world that the German Jews were there to stay, that they were not going to abandon their homeland, and that they would work together to create a rebirth of Jewish life in Germany. And with that said, though, the German Jews did stay staunch supporters of the state of Israel. And they were one of the leading financial supporters of Israel. And so the other thing also was that every young Jewish German was sent to Israel, to kind of look for a nice person to marry. But unfortunately, love, you cannot force it. So that is why over the years, only about 12% of all Jewish Germans were marrying Jews. So you had like this interfaith marriage situation in 88% of Jews in Germany married Christians, because there was this tiny amount of Jewish people that was living there. And so then, the Jewish community was kind of living along, about 28,000 people were living in West Germany. But then something very amazing happened that was so unexpected, and that proved to be life affirming in a way for the Jewish community too: the fall of the Berlin Wall. Subsequently, the German unification, and then, of course, the fall of communism on a whole. Because overall, the Jewish community in Germany has undergone a tremendous involvement in the last 3 decades. And nobody would have thought that that could have been possible, because nothing pointed into this direction. Take a look at this. So here we have the members of the Jewish communities in Germany. So this is starting, as you can see, from 1956. So look, as you can see, goes on, especially, let's say, from like the mid 60s to basically 1990. That's 20 something years. It stays the same. 27,000, maybe 28,000, then again 27,000. And then look what happens in the 1990s. And look how it goes up to 2001. It goes up to almost 90,000 people. Because that, of course, has to do with the fact that when the Soviet Union was falling apart, millions of people, among them many Jewish people, were looking for a new home, and they set their sights for Germany. And the German government was very much caught by surprise. But we also, of course, in Germany, we have these laws that say, these immigration laws that say that if you have German blood, if you can prove, that you have German ancestors, then of course you are eligible for German citizenship. And then also paragraph 116 in our German basic law says that if you have Jewish ancestry, then you are also, and if you can prove that your family or your ancestors were persecuted by the Nazis, you also welcome to resettle in Germany. So, and that is why we have, nowadays, by the way, we have over 100,000 Israelis who live in Israel, but who have dual citizenship, who have German citizenship. And that is why the Jewish communities grew like so exponentially. So for example, here, take a look. You can see how is in about one decade, from 1984 to 1995, how much they actually grew. So if you take a look at the second column, you have Osnabrück, which is a city in Westphalia, in the west. 80 people were in the Jewish community in 1984. And then one decade later, 867. So it was tenfold. And sure, of course, this was a little bit of a problem that was going on there, because these were mostly, Russian Jews who, in a way, they had a different understanding of their religion, different understanding of Judaism, different understanding in a way of the Holocaust. They didn't know how to speak German. So that was the first problem. Then in many cases, then the German Jews were feeling a little, almost pushed out of their communities, because now all of a sudden you had like only 10% German Jews and then 90% of the Russian Jews. So it was quite difficult, it was quite challenging. But one also has to say that in spite of all these growing pains, 30 years into this is a very remarkable process. And the Jewish community in Germany, they seem to be diverse, but they're also, in a way, they are in a good place among each other. So the last 3 decades saw the renovation of a lot of very interesting places. So this is Centrum Judaicum. This is this very beautiful community center in Berlin. And then look, there you have this is Germany's largest synagogue that was also renovated. That's also in Berlin. And then this is a new one. Chabad Lubavitch has their own. And then here, synagogue in Dresden in former East Germany. And then here, this is Chemnitz. This is also former East Germany. And then this is the one in Munich, also new. And then here, this is very interesting, right? This is, I think, the one in Mainz. And there, when this was, when that was given to the public, the German president at the time was saying that creating these synagogues is a continuation that is also showing trust in our nation. And so that was something that was very moving for us Germans. And then one of the one of the greatest compliments is, of course, when a Jewish person says, I can finally unpack my suitcase. And some of them were also saying that. So that was, but that was, remember, that was 5 or 6 years ago. And so then we have, of course, all of these things, we have bagel shops, we have Jewish high schools, and so on. And then here we have Jewish an elementary school. And then this is very interesting. It's called Jurovision. And Jurovision is a singing competition, a dancing and singing competition that is happening every 2 years. And this event is bringing about 1,200 young Jewish performers together. And they had it, as you can see here, in 2018. They had it in Dresden. Academically, today, most big German universities even either have Jewish studies departments or they have workshops. Here, for example, we have a Touro College too, and that is private. That's not, you would have to pay tuition, whereas in other German universities you don't. For example, here, this one, the Abraham Geiger Colleague, this is where you can actually become a rabbi. And this is paid for by the government. So we don't have to pay tuition when we go to public schools. And then here we have 3 of those rabbis, 3 of those people who studied there. And so you would think, isn't that all nice? Well, of course, not all is not well at the moment. Unfortunately, we have to talk about that too. Germany too is dealing with the rise in anti-Semitism, like so many other countries. And it's not always these people, these abhorrent, these neo-Nazis that pose a threat to the minorities, but it's also, in a way, unfortunately, it also anti-Semitism has also been on the rise because, and it's very difficult to kind of say that, but 2015, of course, was the year where Angela Merkel was opening up the borders. And this is when Germany let in over 1 million refugees that were mostly coming from war-torn countries like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then many others were coming from other Muslim countries. And what they have in common, unfortunately, is they come from countries that are suffering in a way from widespread anti-Semitism. And I'm certainly not saying that all 4.5 million Muslims that we have living in Germany are anti-Semitic, but some of them are. Sure, some of them are. And so we have had bullying in schools where Jewish students were threatened by Arab students. And it is a little bit, when you look at this, for example, it's a little bit as if these people, these Muslims, are bringing the Middle East conflict with them to Germany, and they are fighting it by proxy in Berlin. So here you see Muslim protesters burning a handmade Israeli flag in objection to the move of the US embassy to Jerusalem. And we Germans, we are of course looking at the very worrisome development in France being Europe's largest Jewish community with about 500,000 members. Each year, between 7,000 and 10,000 Jews are leaving France in order to settle in Israel because they can't bear the anti-Semitism there. And so this is, of course, terrible. And so the question is, will Jews still be safe in Germany? And as always, I always am saying, I would wish that Angela Merkel, our chancellor, would be a little bit more outspoken about that. But at least now we have this man, as you can see here, the Times of Israel calls him anti-Nazi crusader. This is our Secretary of State. He's 53 years old, and he's Heiko Maas. He's a member from the Social Democratic Party. And he once said the poignant statement, he said, I went into politics because of Auschwitz. And so here we have him, of course, with Benjamin Netanyahu. And he is a big ally to the Jews in Germany and to the Jews in Israel. And here we also see him on a visit to Yad Vashem. So like in so many other countries, Jews unfortunately have become targets in Germany as well. And of course, it is of utmost importance that the majority of Germans are fighting against this dangerous and shameful trend. And we are demonstrating our solidarity with the Jewish community in things like, for example, these demonstrations. This happened in 2018. It was a day, it was called Germany Wears the Kippah, where all these Germans, were running around with the kippah in order to demonstrate their solidarity. And look, not only they, also this lady, look, a Muslim lady also was doing that. So there's another person that we have in our government, and this is this man. This is Felix Klein. And Felix Klein, his entire job, he's actually the Anti-Semitism commissioner of the German government. And his entire job is it to actually come up with strategies to combat hatred against Jews, but only time will tell if that is really going to become very successful. I wanted to mention two projects that at least are trying to change people's perceptions a little, and that has to do with Muslims. And this is this one here. This is very interesting. This is happening in my hometown of Berlin. So you have an organization that is taking young Muslims to concentration camps, like, for example, Sachsenhausen. So these are pictures of Sachsenhausen. And if you can see them here, you can see, at least they look a little pensive, at least they could, you can see, that it does something to them. And so it's so important, that the Jewish communities themselves, they are also focusing on educating and on really working against prejudice. Like, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a Germany-wide event that was called Rent a Jew. And Rent a Jew was like a day where you had where you could actually, as a school or as a university, you could rent a Jew. You could rent these people. Here we have two young Jewish women, and it is important to do it. You might think, oh my God, is that weird? But no, the thing is that in Germany, we have 82 million people, and we have 200,000 Jews. There are so many people who have, it's just 1 in 400 Germans is a Jewish person. So you have so many people who have never even met a Jew. They have never even talked to a Jew. And so that is why it is so important to educate people. And that is what these young women do here. And they are telling these young kids there about their Jewish faith, and so that is also helping. Education is so crucial. And let me end this exploration into Germany's post-war Jewish history by saying that it has been, as we just saw, a long and painful journey. But 76 years after the Holocaust, the Jewish community in Germany, it is a self-confident community, it is a thriving community, but it of course needs our support, our protection, and our constant vigilance to make sure that Jewish people will be happy to live, will be able to live happy lives, to live safe lives in their chosen home country. And that is particularly important for the young generation. Like, for example, these teenagers who were part of that last Eurovision. Of course, last year they couldn't do it because of the pandemic, but they were, the Times of Israel was talking about this. And so they were singing these very moving lyrics in one of their songs. These are all very like poppy, rocky songs, but they were singing this. They were singing, trust in Hashem, will be okay. No matter what comes, we're here to stay. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time and your attention. I am happy to answer questions. Let me stop the share so that we can see each other. Okay, good. So let's see. We have a lot of action in the chat. Let's see.
That was very interesting.
Oh, good, good. I'm glad you liked it. Please address any questions in the. Oh, okay. Hello from Toronto. Hello, Toronto, Canada, even. How great. Violent Palatine are correct. One of the notation. Who were the who were the 1.36 million if only 30% were Jews? Well, Arabs. There were Arabs who were living in Palestine.
That was my question, and I thought you were talking about immigration. I lost track.
No. That was how many people were living in this area.
I got it now.
Okay. Yeah, Offenbach. Why didn't Offenbach have any growth? Interesting. I don't know. Who supported all the Jews from the US? What says that was now? Yeah. Oh, you know what is so interesting about when it comes to the Russian Jews, to the Jews who were coming from the Soviet Union. So remember that when I said that in the beginning, you know, there was this newspaper that was Der Weg, the path, where one of the DPs was saying our young people are our only hope, and our future is dependent on their education. That is exactly what happened with them, because most of these people who were coming from the Soviet Union were, I think it was 60% of them, were over 45 or older. And that's already a problem, right? Because you are, I mean, unfortunately, Germany is a very like a youth, you know, Germany loves youth, you know, and so if you are over 40, it's already a problem when with getting a job, and if you're over 50, forget it. And then, of course, nobody knew how to speak German. So that's why this first generation that was coming there had horrible problems, you know, finding jobs, learning the language. But then their children are thriving like you wouldn't believe, because they are the ones that are the highest educated. And these are not, and these are, you know, they are mostly going, and I mean, most of them are going to the universities. They're mostly doctors, they're mostly engineers. You know, they're not doing masters in philosophy or something, you know, but they are really doing something important, you know. And so they are no, not historians, but they are doctors and surgeons, and they are making a lot of money, and it's really great, you know. It's really they are leaders now. They are really leaders in Germany, and they are now in their 40s, you know, because this whole thing has been happening 30 years ago. So it's quite interesting. And so there was a question, who paid for all of them? Well, first of all, when they came, the government supported them. The German government supports, of course, people who don't have a job, because we have a social net, but it isn't super generous. So it wasn't as if they had Porsches or villas. So that was not the case. And then the Jewish communities were also trying to help with German classes and so on. So and then they became citizens. Yeah. So these the Russian Jews who came to Germany in the 1990s, they became all citizens. So is the Holocaust and the Second World War taught in all schools? Yes. You said 88% of number of Jews are growing. Well, I mean, over the last, I would say, 50 years, there was this, especially like in the 70s and 80s, because you have to see, West Germany was 64 million people and 27,000 Jews. You're not really going to find a lot of Mr. Rights there, you know, if you only have this little tiny group. And so that is why you had this interfaith marriage. But now, you know, since we now have 200,000 Jewish people, now it's easier to find somebody. And so now that's why you have this kind of growing number. But of course, you know, let's be honest. When we talk about the German Jews, you know, it's 90% of them are Russian Jews who have been living in Germany for the last 30 years. But Still. And yes, the Holocaust is, of course, taught in the schools in Germany. We have that. We are usually doing an interdisciplinary approach. So we are starting in the 5th grade, but we are going up to the 12th and 13th grades. And so they are doing that in many different subjects. Like, for example, in German, they would, in the German lessons, they would read the diary of Anne Frank. Then in history, of course, they're talking about it in middle school and in high school. Then, of course, they would do it in religion, so in ethics classes, in political, in how would you say it? Like civics classes also. And then usually, if you live, let's say, for example, the people in southern Germany, in Bavaria, they would go to a concentration camp, like, for example, Dachau, and they would have a field trip there. And then people who are more like in northern Germany, they could go to Bergen-Belsen. That's also a memorial now and a museum. And then people who would be in the west and more in the Berlin area, they would then go to the Jewish Museum there, and also to the new Holocaust Museum that we have in Berlin. That's right next to the Brandenburg Gate, the Holocaust Memorial. And underneath it is a museum that was created in connection with Yad Vashem. So yeah, so that's, we are very adamant when it comes to this. But the other thing is, Germany is, of course, a multicultural society. And you have a lot of people who are Turkish people. You have a lot of Muslims. You have people who are saying, I have nothing to do with this, my family comes from Istanbul. I'm not going to learn anything about the Holocaust. So, and that's a problem, that you have to, as a country, you have to, in no uncertain terms, tell everybody, if you want to live in Germany, you have to deal with Germany's very fraught legacy. And you have to kind of take it on also. So, and then here, Germany has a program called Dagash, where German Jews go to school. Oh, look, we just were talking about that. That's the one to teach German non-Jewish children, including refugees, about German Jewish culture. My daughter, who lives in Leipzig, is friends with Syrian refugees. Stereotyping Muslims is as bad as stereotyping Jews. That's totally right. Yes, and I hope that I haven't done that, but you have to also be kind of honest and kind of say, yes, anti-Semitism has risen, but it's also because of the Nazis, the ones that have the shaved heads, of course. Russian Jews have contributed mightily to classical music in the Bay Area. Yeah, what has been their contribution in Germany? Well, I think like the head of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, I think, is now. He's a son of one of these people who came in the 1990s. And there was also so people were laughing, that when these Jewish people came from Russia, most of them had a violin case with them. So everybody kind of had their own violins. So yes, they were very steeped in classical music. Is it true, Linda says, is it true that it is against the law in Germany to display, publish, and espouse Nazi entities? Yes, very much. So if you are running around, if you think you can run around Berlin and have like a Nazi uniform or whatever, or even scream Heil Hitler or whatever, you will be put into prison. So this could be. You could actually end up in prison for 2 years, or you would have to pay a hefty sum. This is a law from 1945. In November of 1945, it was created by the Allied forces, and we kind of took it over, and it is still true.
Yeah. Screening film, and for allowing us to extend that viewing for another day. Be sure to join the Generations After for our August 29th early fall team membership program. The topic will be Rebuilding Lives, BP Camp United States and Israel. It will feature two expert historians, Dalia Ofer from Israel and Beth Cohen from the United States. Also, if you are not yet a Generations After member, not receiving our monthly newsletter.
Okay. So anything else?
Annette, this is Jake Morowitz.
Yes.
As always, it is informative, a pleasure, and heartwarming to hear your reports on Jewish life in Germany and German reaction to the Jewish world.
Mhm.
As you know, Daniel Kahn performs in Berlin all the time, and he's the person that put Hallelujah into Yiddish.
Oh,
Became
yes.
a big hit and whatever. And I know that especially in Berlin, there's a very vibrant Jewish culture and Yiddish culture.
Right, exactly.
So I want to thank you very much. Please, everyone, we have more programs coming up. Annette, good fortune in your new job in Florida. It sounded exciting. We spoke before you came on. I'm sure you're going to do a wonderful job and educate all those people who want to be educated.
Oh, let me just tell you, I mean, you knew it, but let me just tell everybody, I'm now working in the most Christian environment. Oh, they're really very, very Christian, very conservative. And then I'm coming in there and I said, I'm going to do a program on Germany and Israel. And guess what? I had 120 people who were coming to this lecture. So they were very interested in it. So
Good for you and good for them.
I'm turning them around.
Thank you again. And thank everybody who joined us.
Yes,
Guide
thank you,
yourself.
everybody.
Be well.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.